Last year we did the Hemi Challenger, the year before that the Motion Camaro. For 2 years you Ford fans have been pleading with us to please do a Ford. Well, we hear you guys. This year we're going to do the ultimate Mustang, a 1965 Shelby GT350, a complete ground-up restoration. Well, a couple of months ago, Bill Ockerland out of Michigan gave us a call. He was thinking of buying 525, that's the number of this Shelby. He said it's a really nice, clean driver, but he wanted to take it to the next level. And he also said he wanted to do a few trick items that you guys can put on your Mustang, make it handle better than a Shelby. Now, a couple of things he wanted to do. One was lower the car slightly more than original. They were already lowered 1 inch by Shelby, and he also wanted to go with four-wheel disc brakes. A couple other things he wanted to do involve under the hood. Geez, that hood needs a little bit of adjusting. Good thing we're going to restore it because the paint's chipping off the back. Back to the motor though. These things in stock trim, 306 horsepower out of a 289, more than respectable. The way they made that sort of performance is they went with aluminum intake, set of tri-Y headers, dual point distributor, bigger balancer. Again, very nice street piece. Well, Bill's goal here is to make 380 horsepower. When we sit down with a customer before we do a restoration, we assess where he wants to be, what sort of money he wants to spend, and what sort of performance he wants, because a lot of guys now are starting to say, hey, I want a Concours quality restoration, but I want a little bit more modern performance. So to get 380 horsepower, we're going to go to a set of Webers. Bill also likes the look of those things. We're going to go to a set of aluminum heads. We're going to port and polish those. Mike at Active, of course, is going to do the engine build. He's going to make sure we balance it. It also has to run on pump fuel. That's another thing that Bill really wants. Now, the only way to measure performance gains is either on a dyno, doing a quarter-mile run. What we're going to use is the G-Tech Pro. And this will allow us to do 0 to 60 times before and after. It's going to allow us to take a quarter-mile time now and a quarter-mile time when the car is totally finished. But it also is going to allow us to do 60 to 0 stopping distances, see if the four-wheel disc brakes are really worth the money. And we're also going to be able to do lateral Gs, see if all that suspension work is really going to improve the cornering of this car. The only way to see if any of those modifications are worthwhile to Bill and you, the viewer, if you're thinking about them, is to measure them. So let's do that right now. First thing we're going to do is test lateral continuous Gs. All right, we got 0.072 continuous lateral Gs. Very respectable considering stock suspension, stock set of tires. Now let's go do some 0 to 60 times. For 0 to 60 time, we did that in 8.1, and our quarter mile was a 15:37, and we did that in 93 miles an hour. Now the roads here, they're not exactly great roads here, so considering stock tires and stock suspension and a really stock motor, that's kind of what we're expecting. 96 feet in 10.62 seconds. Well, we've got all our technical data now. We got 0 to 60, we've got 60 back down to 0 quarter-mile times. We've got it all. We're going to compare the before to the after once the restoration is totally done. We're going to continue to do our regular ground-up restoration. Now, don't let that scare you away. We're going to spend 1,000 hours doing the regular stuff, but we got a lot of tips for you guys at home to hot rod your Mustang. We're going to do a little more than the standard restoration. We're going to lower it. We're going to do the performance modifications to the suspension. We're going to do the brakes, and we're going to do the motor. So stay tuned. This is going to be an exciting season at the Pro Shop. Like with any ground-up restoration, the entire car has to be disassembled. So Ray and Lou have spent the last couple days together taking this thing entirely apart. They removed all the fenders, the hood, the interior, the wiring harness, the rear end, the engine. I mean, every nut and bolt has to be removed. Every nut and bolt has to be inspected, bagged, labeled, and then put on the shelf so nothing gets lost. It's a little more time up front, but it's well worth the effort when you're putting the car back together. As they went along, they also made note of some items, some unique items on these Shelbys. It's got the correct rear limiting cables for the rear end. It's got the correct holes for the lowered front A-arms in this car, and those holes, actually the upper holes have been filled in, so at first we looked at it and thought, uh-oh, is this a real car? And then you can see somebody's actually filled them in with some undercoating. They're there. So we went through all the distinguishing features for a Shelby are here. It's a good, correct car, and as we proceed with this restoration and sandblast it, we're going to find out there's a couple little surprises, I think, and I'm going to show you one of those right now. Now that we've got the car totally stripped down, we can actually see that this car has been in some sort of accident on the right-hand side. And there's a few giveaways. If you look at the pillar here, you can see it's been welded, pulled. You can see some holes where somebody's done a poor repair. You can see some brazing into the roof area. And the whole dash on this side has been crumpled, repaired, and maybe pulled out, and then it's got some sort of body filler or fiberglass put on it. The tranny tunnel's been bashed up a fair bit, suggesting that maybe it was a pretty good shot too, and that the car was on a frame machine. One of the other things that we found as we stripped the car is the seat perches have either been lowered or they've been totally changed, but they're not the original location for the seat perch. The rest of the car appears to be a fairly solid car. All the numbers are in the correct location, all the Ford numbers are intact, which is great, and the Shelby numbers all stamped in the front aprons, which is what we're looking for a good original car to restore. So the car requires a little bit more work, and I think that when we take this thing to the sandblaster, we're going to find out exactly what the extent of the damage was. Now, before we can take it there, we had to make a dolly, and Keith got to work putting this dolly together for us, and it's something that's fairly simple, something that you can do at home. It's just a square tube frame, but the trick is to make it a little bit oversized, because what you want to do later is add a couple more uprights to it so we can pick up the original suspension points. That way, when you're doing all your body work, bolting the fenders, doors on, it's sitting the way it would sit on the ground normally once the car's all put together. For right now, though, he did the frame, added the big dolly wheels, and you go with a little bigger wheel because as you're pushing it through the sandblaster or going over some ruts, it won't get stuck as easily. Then he made the uprights, and they're fairly simple, and he's got a piece on top here that just clamps to the pinch well and holds the body in place. You just put a bolt through it, bolt it down tight, and the body won't go anywhere. And this is what we use to get the cars rolled around, going to the sandblaster, doing any other work that we need to do in and out of the spray booth, that sort of thing. So these are fairly simple, easy to make, and useful. Something you should do at home. Our next step is to remove all the paint and all the undercoat from our project car, and we brought in an expert, Steve Lawrence from ProBlast. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hi, Peter. Thank you.
You've got a product, the K2, which works a little bit different than soda. Why don't you tell us about it?
It's a non-destructive media, potassium sulfate. It picks up where soda left off. It goes to the next mile.
All right, so what does that mean for somebody like me as far as once the car has been blasted with K2, I don't have to wash it? Is that the big advantage?
One of the issues with soda was you had the citric wash or vinegar and water with the car.
Right.
How much vinegar, how much water to remove the residue? The residue that's left behind will come back to haunt you down the road. With K2, we don't leave any residue behind. It leaves a very clean, no profile on the car.
So we can blast it, vacuum it, just wipe it down, and paint.
Right, that's correct. Metal preparation is always the key to the good paint job. What we do is after the K2 is done, the restorer would then clean the car, make sure there's nothing left behind, same metal prep techniques that you would normally use, and then get on with it. You don't have to worry about did you get the residue off. The caustic soda is not an issue.
Perfect, and I have the feeling that my earlier suspicions will be realized once we finish K2ing this body. Now that we got the car back from the sandblaster, there are no more secrets. And we kind of suspected the car had been hit in this corner, and we were right. The car had been punched really hard, probably about 20 years ago by the looks of the repair. They actually used lead and brass in this thing, and that's the way they were fixed 20 years ago. Now, this car would probably have also been written off if it weren't a Shelby. A regular Mustang, there's enough damage here that it would have probably went to the junkyard. One of the other things we found with the damage in this car is this minimal rust damage. The right rear trunk pan, couple holes, a really poor repair done there. That's all been kind of fixed, but now the sandblaster's exposed everything. The wheel lips in the rear, we thought were actually cut and rolled up. Well, the lips, we're going to use them. They even have the original lining holes still in them. We're going to pull them back down, hammer and dolly them, and save the original quarter panels on this car. Now, when you see this sort of damage, you've got the entire A-pillar here, the door post has been changed, the cowl here, part of it's been spliced in. The rest of the cowl is actually shaped the wrong way now from the shot. The dash, the impact traveled all the way along the dash right over to the steering column. Now, when it got hit here, the rocker panel has been all wrinkled, and the shot actually transferred all the way over into the tranny tunnel, and you can see that's all been wrinkled. We're gonna have to replace the floor pans on both sides. They're also wrinkled. Now, there's a little bit of damage to the front cross member, but that has nothing to do from the accident. For some reason, it looks like somebody actually dollied in the front cross member to make something fit, maybe fog lights or who knows what. Anyway, the car had that much damage to it back then, we thought we'd just check the repair because the repair was done decent for a body shop, not the way we'd want to fix it, and we thought we'd check up on whoever repaired it 20 years ago. For that, we sent it over to Lance at Milltown Collision.
The first thing we did is put it on the plate and then mounted it onto a P4 system. P4 system holds the vehicle to the plate so that you can measure it and if you have to, pull it. When we hang the laser, we measure from right to left, measure the points that are damaged on the vehicle. In this case, this car was hit in the right front door post. We found it to be short 1.5 inches from right side to left side. Well, once we're sure that that's what the problem is, then we will hook up the change clamps, so on and so forth, and start to pull. As we're pulling, we are measuring to make sure we don't over pull it. The rear suspension points were in the correct spot. The front suspension points were in the correct spot. A little bit of damage to the front rad support, which again is up high and very far away from suspension points. So what we did, basically we measured all the suspension points, all the pickup points for the doors, the door latches, just to make sure that everything was in spec so that the panels could be dollied out where the damage is, replaced if necessary, and then put back together.
Now that we got the car back from Lance and we're sure the suspension points are all square where they should be, he's pulled the door post out, that 1.5 inches that had been pushed in. The repair had been done, but not 100%. Now what we do is we put it up on a surface plate. And what a surface plate is just a great big steel plate, weighs about 5 tons, that's level and flat. And then what we use is these jacks here. And we take the original datum sheet with all the measurements of the frame on this car, and we set them up on our jack stands here. We raise the jack stands, they actually turn to the heights that we need, and then we weld them directly to here. So now this thing is jigged to a plate that isn't going to move. We can cut any part of the floor out, we can cut out any part of that rocker panel and make sure the car doesn't flex or twist. Fairly important with a car like this, very important with a convertible, especially a unibody convertible. Now that that's all done, we're ready to go to the next step and start splicing in some of the pieces of the dash and the floor pans. Well, work's continuing on the 65 Shelby, and what we did is we started at the back of the car. The car is actually a really nice rust-free car. Original set of quarter panels that we wanted to save. The only damage really to them is somebody had stuck a big fat tire under this thing and rolled the lips. So what we did is we pulled back the original lips. They were in perfect condition. We actually used a set of pliers, pulled it down, hammered and dollied the original lip back in, even the lineup holes were still there. Now in the trunk, there was a couple of small minor holes. Rather than replace the entire trunk pan, what we did is we cut out that triangle where that hole was, we recessed in the drain hole and butt welded it in. Now what we did there is we saved all of the original spot welds, so when somebody looks in the trunk, they don't think any repair has been done on this thing. Unfortunately, with the floors, we couldn't save them. So National Parts Depot sent us up a new set of floors, seat perches, and front frame rails. And when we got this thing back from Lance from the frame machine, we actually found out that this post here was in an entire inch when they'd repaired it. So what they did is they shimmed out the door to kind of make it fit. When we cut this floor section out, that whole post almost popped out to where it should be. You can see what the wrinkles were. They were taking up almost an inch of space. So that side of the floor we've already finished. We couldn't finish this side until we put in the new corner. What we did here is we got a rust-free section, a front clip from a 65 Mustang. Then we cut out the section that we needed here and simply grafted it in.
We got pretty involved with this car. The first thing we had to do was pull the cowl off it and pull the dash out because we knew those parts were going to be gone.
Right.
We already had the new clip. I had a pretty good idea of the pieces that were available to us and what we were going to be able to do with them. We took the old pieces off, drilled out all the spot welds, and found underneath we had a problem with one of the hats for the defroster system. They have a little piece that's welded to the top of the inside of the cowl to keep the water from going down inside the car.
Right.
They always go rusty around the bottom corner.
That's right. That's a real common problem actually with Mustangs. The leaves and the dirt go into the cowl here, they collect around this hat, that hat rusts, and your Mustang leaks. And we get calls all the time for people asking, how do we repair this? Now they have a simple fix where they put just a little cover over this to keep the rain out of it.
Mickey Mouse.
But if you want to fix it properly, it's really involved. The fenders have to come off, the hood has to come off, the windshield has to come out, part of the dash has to come out. You have to remove this entire cowl section here, just like what Keith did for this accident repair, and replace those hats. The hats are available from National Parts, or you can make them one or the other. You graft in that entire hat, and now you've eliminated the rust. Then you have to replace the cowl, and there's probably, how many spot welds along here? You drilled them out.
There's got to be 50 spot welds, maybe 60 spot welds around this.
60 spot welds, they have to go back in, windshield back in, cowl back on, fenders, hood, and then repaint the thing. That repair is almost $5,000 for a Mustang, something to watch out for too. Now what else did we have to do in this corner?
Well, we had to remove the old metal. We cut the piece off. We recut from the other panel, make sure that everything's going to be compatible. We grafted the piece in, we butt welded everything together, replaced the spot welds. We staggered the welds for strength on the windshield post and on the rocker panel.
Okay, what's staggering the welds, what Keith means by that, is we use the inside of the pillar here, and then he slices it along the weld here, and then welds it again at the bottom of the pillar. So you're picking it up at the top and the bottom instead of cutting it straight through.
You cut it straight through, it's a weak point. You've got a welded area, and I don't care how good your welds are. You should stagger the welds anyway, so that you've got one on the top, one on the bottom, and then you can plug weld in between. It makes a much stronger joint.
Right, and we did that on the rocker as well.
Did it on the rocker panel because it's actually part of the frame system on a unibody car. That's where all the strength is.
Right. Okay, so the only thing we really have left on this car is we have to put in the floor pan, we have to put in this frame rail, and that's pretty much all the metal work. And what we're going to do next week is we're going to actually look at a fiberglass repair, because keep in mind, Shelbys do have some fiberglass components. This one's got a hood that's been tweaked around a little bit. It looks like it's been opened more than once.
Somebody's been at it before,
yeah. So we're going to show you some fiberglass repair next week. Now that all the metal work is done on the 65 Shelby, it's time to do the body work. But before we can do that, we have to totally assemble the car. First thing we do is we put on the doors. We make sure that the doors fit to the quarter panels and there's a nice even gap all the way down and along the rocker panel as well. Then we bolt on the fenders, and again, we have to tweak those a little bit, make sure that they fit, and there's a nice even gap, 1/4 inch all the way down the fenders. And same from side to side. Sometimes you have to pull the door out slightly to match the fender or the quarter panel. Once the big panels are in place, then we start with the end caps, the front headlight buckets, the valances, and the trunk lid. Trunk lid, we make sure we put the weather strip around it, put the latch in, latch it down so it fits the top of the quarter panels really nice. Then all the body work takes place. We line up all those panels, and then we start the blocking process. And you probably remember the blocking process from last year's Hemi Challenger. Ryan spent hours and hours blocking that car, making sure that none of it folded in on the corners as we showed you last year. Now, we're not going to go through all that this season again, but what we're going to do is teach you what's unique to a Shelby. All Shelbys had fiberglass components. 65s actually had the least components, just with the hood. By 66, they had fiberglass side scoops. By 68, they had fiberglass trunk lid and end caps. By 69, they also had fiberglass fenders. Half the car was fiberglass. So this is a very important repair. Now, Shelby also had problems with this fiberglass. They started out with fiberglass hoods and frames, and then they realized they were bowing with the pressure from the spring. They eliminated the hood catch on those cars and just went to hood pins first. Well, what happened there is the odd time, as what happened with this hood here, is somebody left the hood pins out, drove away, and up popped the hood. All they saw was white with blue stripes. Now, we were sure that this happened with this car because the frame here was actually tweaked, right?
Yeah, it was full of Bondo all down in here. It was covering up all these holes here. There was rivets holding all the fiberglass to the metal skin all around the whole hood.
So what actually happened is the hood started to delaminate from the metal component here. So what did we do there? We took it right apart?
Yes, we took the whole skin right off the hood itself. We scraped all the fiberglass off. It actually was delaminating the whole way around the hood, so it wasn't too hard to pull it off.
Okay, and then what we did is we took the frame into the sandblaster, blasted it on both sides because there was actually a little bit of rust starting underneath there, and epoxy primed it. Now that we had that done, what was the next step?
We brought it back, fitted in, and did basic fiberglass work around the hood to attach the skin to the hood.
Okay, but one of the problems that we have with Shelbys is they didn't fit very nice from the factory, and this car is going to be above a factory finish. It's going to be a concourse restoration, maybe something that would go to Meadowbrook or Pebble Beach. So what we actually did is made sort of a mold, if you want, or a jig that we could pinch these panels together.
Yeah, we made pieces that fit the fenders perfect. We set them up on with the hood, and then we used them to, get our line for the hood.
Right. So the top of the fender is now going to fit the top of the hood.
Yeah, it's going to fit perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Now, once you've got it clamped together and in place, and we've actually pre-assembled it to make sure it fits in the hole of the fenders and the cowl, then what's the next step to actually laminate the two together?
It's just basic fiberglass work, laying down mat and resin and just matting it together, making sure it's, you got a clean surface and you're getting out all the air bubbles when you're doing your resin work.
All right. So really all we have left here is to finish grinding off the excess fiberglass.
Yep.
And then it's ready for epoxy primer. Now the top of this still needs to be stripped, and after we strip that, we're going to fit it in the hole, put it on the hinges, and do all our body work in place with the hood pins there. Once that's accomplished, we go to the color build primer. That's our last priming session. After that's done, we will 400 wet and then 600 wet sandpaper. That gives us the finish we need to actually start paint. So we're almost there, a little bit more. Well, the 65 Shelby is just about ready to paint, and actually it's already been painted, part of it. The base of the stripes have been done. Now 65 Shelby is a little different than most cars. You've got stripes that are not straight up the top of the car. We actually had to do a fair bit of measuring and taping.
Yeah.
Now what's involved in laying out the stripes on a car like a Shelby?
Basically, we put all the panels on the car, align the panels the way they're going to be once the car is finished. Then I take the blue, Guardsman Blue base coat, I spray the whole center of the car until I think I have full coverage. And then I put about 2 coats of clear on, let it cure, and wet sand the top of the car, and then we measure out our stripes and mask where the stripes are actually going to be.
And actually, like I said earlier, a 65 Shelby is not 2 10-inch stripes all the way down. They start at 9 1/4 on the front of the hood, go to 10 1/2 by the cowl. They start at 10 1/2 on the roof section, go to 10 3/8 by the back of the roof, and taper all the way back down to 10 inches. The reason for this is the car is kind of wide in the middle, tapers front and rear, so you need the stripes to follow that. Otherwise, there'd be an optical illusion and it would look really funny. Now, once we've got the base done, before we can actually start on the white base and the clear, we've got to do the seam sealer.
Yeah, what we use is a product called Worth. It's a sprayable sealer. You put it in a special gun, and we can spray it on the car and duplicate the original seams where they had brushed them on, or if we want like a rubberized undercoating look, we can turn the valve on the gun and make it spray out the way we want it to look.
Now that the seam sealing's all done, I guess we're almost ready to spray.
I'm gonna go mix the paint up right now.
Okay. Before we finish or actually start applying the paint, what we'll do is we'll pre-clean all the entire car again. Keep in mind, we just sprayed all this undercoating, this rubberized undercoating. If there's any mist in the air, we want to take that off. After that, we want to tack down the car, make sure if there's any dust, it comes off. Then we're ready to lay down the Wimbledon White. What we're using is a PPG base Deltron system, and after that step is done, we're going to probably lay down 3 or 4 coats of base, make sure all the jams are done nice, make sure in the trunk's done nice, all of the corners. We go around with a trouble light, make sure that the coverage is 100%, especially with a white car. So all the edges set?
Yeah, just checking all the edges, make sure I got enough coverage around the stripes, so when we put the rest of the panels back on, it's all gonna match perfectly.
Perfect. So that's something really important. Again, like I said, with light cars, go around with a trouble light, make sure all the edges are covered. Now I think we're at the stage where we peel off the...
Yeah, if you want to give me a hand, we can start taking these off.
Yeah, it's a real good idea to, if you've got a car that's striped, to physically take the tape off while the other paint, not that you can touch it, it's dry to the touch, but it's still semi-soft and it doesn't tend to wrinkle on the edges as you're pulling it back. And you actually use the tape itself to cut the paint. And this tape is called fine line tape. It's not just masking tape.
Now that we've unmasked the car, we can see here we have a couple problem areas where the white did get underneath the fine line tape. Now the reason why we clear coated the blue before we masked off the stripes is if I was going to take any overspray off, I would use a mild degreaser. But the mild degreaser takes off the white base, it would also take off the blue, and we'd be back down to the primer. Therefore we have to respray all of this. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of this degreaser, and I'm going to wipe the spots, and the overspray should come right off.
Now that we took care of that little bit of overspray on the blue, we're ready for final inspection. We go over the entire car, we take the tack rag, make sure all the little dust particles are off, and then we put on 4 coats of Global PPG Clear. And the reason we do 4 coats is twofold. One, we want to bury the stripes entirely on this so you don't feel an edge. Secondly, when we sand and polish, we're going to be fairly aggressive. We're going to go 1,000, 1,500, and then 2,000 grit paper, and that's going to take off almost 2 coats of clear. So Greg, I think you're set to go. Spray away.
All right.
It's engine day again at Legendary Motorcar, and anytime we deal with motors, we come to Mike at Active Engines. Good to see you again, Mike. Well, what we've got here is Bill Ockerland's original motor wasn't in the car. What we found was an experimental motor actually out of a GT40. Bill said he wanted to save that. Maybe he's going to buy the GT40 to match the motor. And he said he wanted a little bit more horsepower, so we came to Mike. And Mike, what did you come up with?
We started out, Peter, with an SVO block. It's a special aftermarket block with a high nickel content and 4-bolt main caps. We start the actual block preparation out by line honing the main saddles. It trues up all the main saddles. Once that's done, it comes over to the boring and honing section, and we bore and hone it with, as you can see, a torque plate in place. We finish the cylinder bores off. Then the block goes through a dummy assemble, and once we know where we want our deck heights to be, the block's going to go over and be square decked on our BHA resurfacer, and then we're ready to go with the block.
Okay, once we have the block ready, now we talked about Bill wants some big torque out of this thing. What do we need to do?
Peter, what we did was we ordered a SCCA Enterprises reciprocating mass, and we've increased the cubic inch displacement of this motor from 289 inches up to 347 inches.
Perfect.
From here, what we do is once everything's fit and we're ready to go, the last thing we're going to do is balance the reciprocating mass. Why don't we go over and have a look?
Sounds good. Reciprocating mass, pistons, pins, rings, connecting rods, crank.
Yes.
So you got to balance each one of these. Tell me the steps, the process.
Pete, what we do is we measure the weight of the pistons, we take the lightest one, and then we remove weight from the heavier pistons and make them weigh all the same.
So once you got the pistons all the same sort of weight, then you start with the connecting rod.
That's right. You take the big end of the rod, you weigh them up, you pick the lightest one, and you remove weight from the heavier rods until they weigh exactly the same.
And you do that just on the belt sander.
That's right, Pete. You just bring them over here and you remove a small amount of weight. Hopefully they're very close, and you remove just a small amount of weight to make them weigh all the same.
Then once you've got the pistons, the rings, the rods, all the same weight, balanced, then you go to the crankshaft?
Yeah, sort of, Pete. We can't put the pistons and the rods and everything on the crank and spin it on the machine. So what we do is we work those weights through a formula, and we come up with what you call a bob weight, which is basically a device that just you affix to the crankshaft, and you make them weigh exactly the same as what your pistons and rods would weigh.
That's the one Tom almost lost his fingers with last year?
That's the one, that's right.
Now, once we've got the reciprocating mass done, we go to the heads, and that's where we make power, right?
That's right, that's where all the power's made.
Okay, let's go to the flow bench. For all the years I've known Mike, he's always said the bottom end of the motor, the crank rods, all that sort of stuff is just a pump. All the horsepower is made in the heads. You've got this thing on the flow bench. We went with an Edelbrock Victor Jr. head. What's the reason behind that?
These heads feature a 210 cc runner volume, and right out of the box, these heads are good for over 500 horsepower. They're made of a higher grade aluminum, and they feature a one-piece phosphorus bronze guide, and they're just a great head out of the box to start with.
Okay, so you actually started with putting the raw head on the flow bench. What was the actual flow number for just the head?
Right out of the box, as we tested them, these heads will support almost 580 horsepower.
Okay, now we bolt on the Weber intake, which is what Bill wants for this piece, and the horsepower dropped off dramatically, didn't it?
Yeah, it dropped off almost 11% or almost 85 horsepower.
Okay, and by the time we put in a streetable cam, we're going to probably drop off a little bit again?
Yeah, because this guy's going to drive this car on the street and we can't run perhaps as much duration as we'd like to in the camshaft, we're probably going to lose about 50 horsepower.
If you could stick around, maybe a little later, you could explain how we can get these heads for more of a race application to really make that 580 horsepower.
Sure, that'd be great, Pete.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Well, the interior on a 65 Shelby isn't exactly a big challenge for a guy like Gary at Diamond Upholstery. He does all our upholsteries at Legendary here. Now, what we did is we went to National Parts. They gave us a new upholstery kit. They gave us new buns. Gary installed that, did a nice job. That's it for upholstery. Now, the trick to one of these cars is actually in painting the interior panels, and there's a whole bunch of different panels and different techniques to be used here. The door panels are actually steel and they're grained. So a lot of guys, when they start working on these, take a DA or a sander, start sanding the paint off, and they realize they've ruined the interior graining on it and it's gone. The way to do this properly is to sandblast the panel itself, prime it, and then paint it. Now, as far as the back panels here, these are actually fiberglass panels. You can't really sandblast these panels or they're going to be destroyed. So what we do is just take a Scotch pad, smooth over the rough edges here, and just paint that the same as we do the steel panel here, but we can't sandblast this. Same with up top here. It's a fiberglass piece, but it's a smooth one, so we're not as concerned about the graining as this bottom piece. We sand that smooth, we prime it, we paint it. Nice, simple process. The dash is very similar. Again, it's a piece of metal, sand it, prime it, paint it. Now, the interior isn't just about the upholstery and the painted areas. You've got things like the gauges here. We take the gauges apart, actually make sure all the gauges work first. That's pretty easy to do with a tester. Then what we do is put a whole new dash bezel on top. The lenses come in a kit, all available at National Parts. It's a nice, slick deal. Put it together, it takes maybe an hour, and you've got a brand new looking dash. 65 Shelbys, they're the only ones with this dash pod here in the middle. You've got the oil pressure gauge and you've got a tack. You want to make sure those are working. These ones here, we actually replaced the gauges. The other ones weren't working. They're all available at National Parts. The glove box door is another grain piece. You don't want to sand out the grain, so you want to hit it with a scuff pad, paint it, make sure that grain stays in there. Now, the wood steering wheel on this thing is obviously not here, and what we're doing with that is we're going to refinish it. There's a couple of cracks in that steering wheel. They need to be filled, then sanded out, and then urethaned. When we're finished with that, we have a real wood wheel that looks brand new. The other step that we do is with the aluminum spokes in there, they get polished so they look like brand new. By the time you put a new center cap in, it looks like an entire brand new dash and steering wheel. Looks great. Now, the interior doesn't just stop at the things you see. If you look in the steering column here, we've got a new turn signal switch. Lots of times, guys, when they're doing restorations, don't bother going this in depth, and they just leave these sort of pieces. Then you find out later the turn signal switch doesn't work. You got to take down the entire steering column again to make sure it works. Same with the canceling cam. Sometimes that hasn't been replaced. You turn on your turn signal, doesn't want to come off as you turn the wheel back to the left or to the right. The other thing that we notice whenever we do an interior is you can keep getting carried away. This one here has an original set of seat belts. They looked really good when we started this project, but by the time we put in new carpets, new seat covers, repainted all the panels, they kind of look worn out. So I think what we're going to do is order a new set of these. Now, the interior on a 65 Shelby or a Mustang for that matter, something that you should probably try at home. The only thing you have to be careful about is don't ruin the graining on the door panels, don't ruin the graining on the fiberglass panels. Prime them before you paint them, and you're going to have a nice clean interior. The rest of it's straightforward. Carpets, easy to lay in, just trim the edges. You can do that yourself. Seat covers, you might want to try yourself, maybe take those into an upholsterer. Now, it's not going to be that much longer. We're going to have a steering wheel on this thing. We're going to have the radio block-off plate on, and I'm going to be driving this car. Well, the guys are hard at it now, and now that we've got that killer 289, actually it's a 347 motor built, we're going to make all sorts of horsepower. It's time to get this thing stopped. We had a bunch of different options available to us. We could go with the standard disc brakes in the front and the drum brakes in the back, the 2.5-inch, 10-inch originals, but the stopping power we want a little bit better. And when we started this whole project, we talked to Bill, and Bill said we want this thing to stop a lot better than an original car. So we decided 4-wheel disc brakes. Then what we had to decide is how big of brakes do we want to go with it. We had the option of going with these giant rotors here, and they work great. They're going to be an excellent stopping power, but the problem is we can't run the original Cragar wheel underneath those giant rotors. So what we opted for in the end is a standard four-wheel disc brake setup that's available through National Parts. They're the supplier for all the parts on this car, and they're built by Classic Tube, and we're going to see Paul a little bit later. So what we did is we went the standard four-wheel disc brake setup. We've got the rear discs. They're going to stop it a lot better. The only addition we did is we added these wiper grooves. What they do is allow the brake dust to come out as well as the gases, and it actually helps cool a little bit as well. Now, one of the other things we're going to discuss a little bit is brake pad material. There's two different types of pads we can go here that are both aggressive. The Hawk black pads are a fairly good combination street race pad, and they're going to create a little bit of dust. If we want really aggressive brakes, we're going to go with the Hawk Blues. They're going to create a fair bit more dust on these brand new wheels, and that's up to the owner depending how much time he wants to spend cleaning these things. Now, one of the other modifications we're going to do is more safety related than anything. We're going to go with a dual reservoir master cylinder. Each side of this actually feeds the front, the other feeds the rear for brakes. That way, if you lose brakes, you lose a caliper, lose a line, you still got some braking. Real important thing, trust me, at 100 miles an hour. Here's the old one. You can see one reservoir, both are feeding off of this. If you have a leak, you're going to lose brakes entirely. Now, one of the last things we're going to do, and this is a real minor modification as far as it's really easy to hide on your car, is a proportioning block. And what this does is it regulates the amount of braking we're going to get from the front as opposed to the rear. Since about 80% of your braking is done up front, think about it. You stand on the brakes, all the weight transfers to the front of the car. That's where most of your braking is going to happen. This allows you to dial that in to the type of track condition, to the weather. If it's raining, we can make some adjustments. We can also fine tune it above and beyond a stock system that's set or preset. This is a neat little item, and we can tuck it away. Nobody will ever know we've got it. The last safety item we're going to do is the stainless steel brake lines. They're a flex line. And it actually does two things for us. Number one, it becomes a safety item. It's a lot harder to cut this sort of line or rip this sort of line if you go a little off-roading at the track the way Tom does. The other thing it does for you is when the brakes get really hot, a regular rubber line is actually going to expand with that brake pedal pressure. The fluid in here is actually going to push the line and you're going to get a spongy pedal. You're not going to be able to increase the size of this line. It's a small line to start with, and it's got all the braiding on it. So on this project, what we've done is we've done four-wheel disc brakes. It's going to give us a little better stopping power. We've gone to an aggressive pad, which is really going to help with the stopping power. And then we've done a couple safety items. We've done double master cylinder, which I recommend for anybody, even on a street car. It's nice to have that backup. And we've gone with the stainless steel brake lines. Well, Lou and Ray have been hard at work making sure this car stops. The next thing is making sure it corners well. Now keep in mind, a 65 Shelby, great cornering car to start with. Keep in mind these cars were B production race cars. Carroll Shelby took a lot of his work onto the street cars. They lowered the front suspension. The A-arms are lowered 1 inch. They had a better shock. They had a set of conies adjustable all the way around. That was kind of unheard of for a production car back in the 60s. They had this override rear traction bar, and what that did is it tried to eliminate the wheel hop when you're coming off the corner. It also had a set of limiting cables, so when these cars got light, like over the crest of Moseport, the rear ends didn't just drop and end up on the suspension. The limiting cables caught them. That was all stock suspension for the 65 Shelby. Now what we're trying to do is improve on that slightly and still maintain that stock original look. What we went to is a little heavier rear leaf spring. This is a Global West piece, which is available through National Parts. What we also did is, instead of going with the regular rubber bushings like this one has here, we went with a urethane bushing. That's going to give us more positive response in the corners. The car isn't going to be as sloppy. The rubber gives away a little bit, the urethane doesn't. On the full-blown race cars, you can even go to aluminum bushings. That's a real positive response. Now the upper override bars, we're going to leave the urethane bushings in so they don't bind up as much. And that gives us a little bit of give here. Now as far as the shock, these Coney shocks, great shocks. We've used them on lots of race cars, but they're a little tough to adjust when you're at the track. You actually have to remove the lower mount, compress the shock, do your adjustment, put it back, and see if it works. what we went to was a SPAC shock, and this is a gas shock, and it's adjustable with this little screw at the end here, and we can adjust it 10 different settings, and it's easy to do. It takes 30 seconds. You get under the car, turn it, go out, see if it works. That pretty much covers the rear suspension on this car. Let's go to the front. Well, on the front suspension, again, we want to maintain a fairly stock look. Now, Global West, through National Parts, has this great A-arm kit, but it's a tubular A-arm. We want it to go with the original ones, even down to the 4-rivet ball joint. All the remanufactured ones are actually a 3-rivet ball joint. Any concourse guy is going to tell you right away that's an aftermarket A-arm. Now, as far as the bushings, we went with urethane bushings again. On the spring perch, we went on the lower control arm, and even in here, we've adjusted this real nice, and we've got the original lowered A-arms, 1 inch, like the factory did that. We go to the spring next, and you can see the difference not only in the coil size, but also in the height of the spring we're going to. This is a stock spring. This here is a 620-pound spring, a lot stiffer spring, and it's going to have the front end sit down a little bit lower because of the height, and it's also going to take a little more to compress the front end. Going back to shocks, we had the options again of going with the Conies or the SPAC. Now the SPAC shocks, we've actually detailed these to look like a stock shock, and again, you've got that adjusting screw, which makes it nice and easy. On the front here, it's a real pain to take this thing off, compress it, take the shock out, and play with it. Good shock, just a little different way of doing it. As far as the sway bar, Shelby's came stock with a 1-inch sway bar. That's more than adequate for what we need here. Again, we went with the urethane bushings just to make sure that we're using the sway bar, not the compression in the rubbers here when the car starts leaning. There is an aftermarket sway bar that is adjustable, that is kind of neat, but again, it doesn't look too stock. Going to the steering, that's another issue again. Now the stock steering on a 65 Shelby is more than adequate for what we're doing here. The steering box is a quick ratio box, and then Shelby also added a pitman arm and an idler arm to make it even quicker. The last thing is the export brace, and what this piece actually does is make the front shock towers nice and rigid, and this is almost spring loaded. Be careful when you're putting this on. This thing will bite you here and take a finger off. The last piece that Shelby added was a Monte Carlo bar. This makes the whole front shock tower setup nice and rigid. Shelby's come with great suspension right from the factory. We've done a few additions. We're trying to make it look stock, and this should add maybe close to 1 or 0.1 of a G on the skid pad. Well, now that the 65 Shelby is basically complete, comes down to the details, and that's the difference between a good restoration and a great restoration. And a lot of times it's fairly easy to complete the restoration just with the right markings, the right chalk marks, the right decals, and the right stamps. Now, quite often, a lot of these pieces are available. National Parts has a concourse restoration kit. It's got all the right decals for it, and then sometimes we actually make up some of our own pieces. Let me show you what we do there just to get all the right things. Like I said, a lot of these parts are available now through National Parts, the correct decals. But when you can't get them, what we've done over the years is you just go to a rubber stamp company, give them a photograph of exactly what you want. They'll duplicate it on a rubber stamp. You either spray it or you brush it on just with model paint. You stamp it on, and you've got the exact marking that the factory would have used years ago. Now, as far as chalk marks, they really aren't chalk. What they are is a Markel paint stick. And these are available, again, through National Parts, and they have all the different colors of markings. And these are what we use for the rear end markings, for any of the date code markings. Anything that came on the car originally can be duplicated with these, and they last quite a long time. Again, you can just go under there before a concourse, touch them up, make them look fresh again. But these things here, they make the car look really nice. Now, as far as this car here, was a ground-up restoration, but we know that we cheated with a couple items. We put the Webers on. We actually hid an MSD into the glove box. We actually had to put a fuel regulator on this thing for the Webers because we only need about 3.5 pounds of fuel pressure, so we tucked that away so you can't see it from the top. Another great little thing are these battery covers. You can take a modern battery that cranks 670 amps, lasts forever, it's maintenance free, put this piece over top of it, and it looks like the original piece. Slick idea there. Now let's go to the interior. The interior, it's pretty straightforward, but there's a couple items here that really set it off. You've got the starting instructions over the sun visor, you've got the heater instructions right here, and you've got a warning for disc brakes. I guess you needed to be warned that it would stop. You've got here the original floor mats that would have come. Now all of these stickers here, these would have been inspection stickers when the car left the assembly line. Now if you've ever bought a brand new car and had a chance to look at it before it got PDI'd, this is what it looks like. Usually the dealer removes all these things. People today that are putting away collector cars tell the dealers to leave everything in place. Now let's go underneath the car and see the real nice part. Personally, this is the part that I like best about a restoration, is the undercarriage. You can see all the detail that we've gone to on this car. You can see all the original markings on the car. You can see how the suspension's been detailed. You can see how the white of the body contrasts with the primer and overspray. You can see how the factory would have done this. They would have primed the whole undercarriage, and then the black from the engine bay and the black from the edges would have just kind of misted down wherever. Same with along the floor pans. When the car got painted, all the white overspray just kind of misted over everything. It looks the way the car left the factory. Have a look at a brand new car at a dealership and you'll see it's very similar today. All these markings are on today's cars and they mean something, just like this piece here. Now this car we had a little bit of fun with. We got to hot rod it a little, but the whole idea was to make it look stock to the average guy out there, and I think we've done a pretty good job doing that. Now the next thing is to take it to the dyno, see how it works there, and then we finally get to, don't want to say abuse this car, but we get to have some fun and see if all those modifications we did to this car actually works. See if it works as good as it looks. Well, the 65 Shelby, it's pretty much finished. All detailed out. We've taken it out for a road test. Runs real good. Now we're at the chassis dyno shop and we're going to learn a little bit about horsepower. Now the nice thing about a chassis dyno as opposed to an engine dyno is we get to find out where we're losing all the horsepower that the motor makes. And there's a whole bunch of places in the drivetrain we're going to lose. Clutch, fairly heavy. The reciprocating mass of the entire driveline is important to keep the weight down. Because we want to keep this thing looking original, we didn't go to an aluminum drive shaft. We haven't opted out of the original wheels. If you go to a lighter rim, obviously the inertia that it takes to rotate that rim is a little bit less. The nice thing about a chassis dyno is you can actually test oils as well. Synthetic oils sometimes reduce the drag, increasing the horsepower to the rear wheels. Now a little earlier this season, we had a chance to go down to DEI, and these guys really know their dyno testing. When I told Steve Chris from Dale Earnhardt Incorporated that we were putting a 65 Shelby on the chassis dyno, he said, why don't you come down here? We've got a special dyno set up with a special car that we can teach you a few things, what we can learn from a chassis dyno, and we've got an expert here. We've got Jay Gers to teach us about that. So what's really involved in hooking it up?
Hooking up the chassis dyno, basically you bring the car in here as a complete package. We strap the car down, we make sure it's tight. We have clean inlet air going into the car, and we measure the torque and horsepower based on the change of speed of the drums.
All right, now what else are you trying to learn from this dyno? You're looking for what, vibrations, leaks, all that sort of stuff?
We want to minimize loss of practice at the track, so we check that out here before the car leaves.
So every single motor in the car is actually put on here before it goes to the track?
Well, besides leaks and vibrations, we look at a delta between the water brake dyno and the chassis dyno, and we have an expected number of loss to the drivetrain. If it doesn't meet that, then we realize we have a problem and correct it before it goes.
Now, are you looking for a problem in the motor or the rest of the driveline?
The engine is already dyno before we receive it. We check the whole driveline as a package here.
So getting back to something like our Project Shelby, if we made 500 horsepower on the dyno, which is the number we made, just actually over that, how much do we lose through the driveline?
Depends on the driveline efficiency, somewhere between 5 to 10%.
Now, is that for a race car? Is that sort of a street car application, or is it similar?
Race cars are slightly more efficient, between 5 to 8%, whereas a street car would be about 10 to 12%.
So our Shelby should make somewhere around 450 horsepower, hopefully at the rear wheels. Now, what do you guys do? What do you change to try and optimize your horsepower?
We change inlet manifolds, carburetor functions, and exhaust styles to try to optimize our package.
So this is the first time you're actually trying to simulate a car on a racetrack?
The chassis dyno kind of tricks the car into thinking that it's on the actual racetrack, and based on the speed of a change of the drums, we can get the torque and horsepower measurements.
Well, we're not going to change intake manifolds. We're not going to change the headers on the 65 Shelby. We're probably going to play with jets, and we're probably going to play with the timing a little, but we've learned a whole bunch here about chassis dynos at DEI. Well, we've learned just about everything we can learn from this car on this chassis dyno. We've changed the jets, we've changed the timing, we've got it running as good as we can get it running without altering a bunch of things that's going to leave it not looking stock. We've lost about 20% of the horsepower through the drivetrain. Keep in mind, this is 1965 technology. Well, the next step is to take it out actually to a racetrack and see what it does in the quarter mile, because ultimately that gives you the real answer. Well, it's the end of the season. The 65 Shelby project car, it's finally finished. Now it's testing day and we get to see if all those modifications paid off. Are we going to be running a faster quarter mile? Are we going to go faster? Are we going to stop quicker? Are we going to turn better? Well, we'll find out shortly, I hope. We asked Bill to come along to join us to help test this car. I was expecting you, Bill, not the 67 Shelby. Tell us about this one.
Well, Peter, this is an unrestored car. It happens to be the lowest mileage 67 GT500 in the Shelby registry, and it's a survivor, an unrestored car.
Well, that's what I like about Bill and all the Shelby guys. They bring their cars to use them. Now, we had planned, and Bill drove down 10 hours to Bristol to run these two cars before we do our test with the G-Tech Pro. Now, Tom says we're a bunch of wusses if we don't run this thing in the rain, so we thought we'd send him down the track first.
You know, just because it's raining a little bit doesn't mean that you can't go drag racing. Now, the trick to drag racing is getting a little bit of heat in the tires. All right, so getting some heat in the tires is as simple as putting your left foot on the brake pedal and then spooling up with your right foot. Sooner or later, yeah, you get the idea. All that tire smoke, what it really means is you're getting some heat in the tires. All right, I think we're ready to go. Let's see if we can get this thing hooked up. Okay, maybe not quite hooked up yet, but in a couple of minutes it's gonna hook up.
Well, Tom's still trying to find traction in Bristol. I drove down here to Mooresville to find some dry pavement. So let's do the comparison. Remember at the beginning of the season, we did 0 to 60, we did stopping 60 to 0, we did the lateral G's, and we did the quarter mile. Let's see if all those modifications made a difference. Come on, jump in. First thing we're going to do is 0 to 60 and then stand on the brakes hard and see what our 60 to 0 stopping distance is as well. Wow, these times are a lot better than before. All right, 0 to 60 was 5.25 seconds and 60 to 0 was 161 feet. All right, now we're going to do a quarter mile. Let's see if we can get it hooked up. .109 miles an hour. Now obviously we're not hooking up the tires at that sort of mile an hour with that elapsed time, but these Bridgestones, keep in mind, they're only a 215 series tire, pretty small tire with all that horsepower. Now let's see how it works on the skid pad.
She's just starting to get loose, so maybe we can have some fun with it now.
'Alright, we improved slightly. We got 0.82 now of a G, and then it got loose on me, and that was actually a lot of fun. Now let's do the total comparison. Well, obviously, all those performance modifications, they paid off. I mean, think about it. Our 0 to 60 time went from an 8.1 down to a 5 1/4. Most of that is horsepower through the motor. A lot more horsepower, a lot more torque. Some of it is tire. These tires hook up a lot better than the old ones, and part of it's suspension, obviously a lot better as well. 60 to 0 distance, we went from 196 down to 161 feet. That's 35 feet less stopping distance. Four-wheel disc brakes, well worth the money. How about straight line performance? From a 1560 all the way down to a 13.6 at 110 miles an hour. If we had a slick on this car, we'd be running 12s, no problem. And most important, the fun factor. This car is a ton of fun now to drive. The restoration, 1,000 hours, maybe an extra few hours because of the accident damage and engineering some of these performance modifications. But I think in the end, Bill Aukerland got exactly what he wanted. A stock-looking car, take it to any show, nobody knows it's been modified, but it's got a whole bunch more performance.